Hello, everybody. As I said, this is our WBCSD Nature Action Virtual Event Series session, and we're very excited to welcome you here today. We are expecting more people to join us, but in the interest of time, we will go ahead and get started. Today, we'll be focusing on the Nature Action Agenda, what we need for a healthy and resilient future, and the work of WBCSD together with our members and really important partners in this space. And we'll go ahead and move forward. Next slide, please. I will be your host today. I'm Diane Holdorf. I'm the Managing Director of our Food and Nature program. The co-host today is Peter White. Peter is our ambassador of biodiversity and working with us towards a successful outcome for COP15. And we should add here as well, as we speed into COP26 on the integrated nature and climate agenda. For those who may not know WBCSD, we are a platform of leading businesses with over 200 members built around a common vision that we really have work to do yet to create a world in which more than 9 billion people are all living well and within planetary boundaries by 2050. And we do this by working across several systems. We work on economic systems, including food and nature, which I represent, and many others with members like these that you see here, several of whom have joined us today as speakers in our panel. And why don't you go on to the next slide? We'll speak to the systems that we're working on to set that context for everybody who's on the phone with us. So these are the big economic systems that we work on: cities and mobility, circular economy, climate and energy, food and nature, as I said, how we address the needs of people and equity, and how we redefine value across the finance systems. And when we talk about natural systems and how we impact those, like biodiversity, like climate, we start to think about the cross-cutting aspects that pull all of these sectors together. So we need to be thinking across both economic and natural systems to really transform. Next slide, please. So the system that we'll be talking about today for nature is one that's part of a virtual event series that WBCSD has been leading. We're all very accustomed to now working in our virtual world, and we've been bringing content and topics and speakers together on how we actually address and move forward with these really important areas of our agenda. We've had 2 each week. We've got several more to come. Please feel free to visit our website here, our link, to see what else is coming up. Next slide, please. So a couple of issues, although I'm sure all of us are accustomed to these in our Zoom-based world that we now encounter. This session is being recorded. We are doing that so that we can share that with all participants who've registered. So for everybody here with us today and for all who have registered, we will share the session results with you. To make sure that we can all hear well, all participants are muted, but we do want an active engagement. So we would love for you to please use the chat session. And when we get to Q&A, if you feel uncomfortable using the chat or have something you'd like to say, please raise your hand and then you can unmute and we'll use that function. But otherwise, hopefully we'll have a very active chat section today. As always, we are working in a pre-competitive space here with our members and partners, so we will be avoiding any discussions on pricing, costs, bid strategies, etc. If we feel at any point like we're going into an area that we're not comfortable with, we'll stop. Feel free, please, to do the same, although I don't expect that we will have that issue here with us today. Our agenda, we'll bring you up to speed on the work that we're doing on our Nature Action Project, how we're working together with really important partners, including the World Economic Forum. We're very pleased to have Akansha Khatri from that team with us here today, as well as several of our member companies in the panel discussion that we'll have. And then Eva Zabe will moderate that panel discussion, joining us from Business for Nature. So when we think about the year that we hoped 2020 would be, it has actually turned out quite different than what we expected when we started out this year. And when we launched the Nature Action Project at WBCSD, it was March. And we wanted to have full support around the policy objectives for Business for Nature, working together in partnership with the World Economic Forum. We wanted to make sure that the work that we would do as the WBCSD would really take these very important areas and lead with a business focus. And lead those into those key events for this year. But when COVID hit, everything stopped. And we thought, how do we actually keep the focus on the nature agenda? But what we've actually learned is that this has been a super year in a very different way. We've actually seen the urgency around how nature loss affects zoonotic diseases into human health, into economic systems become tragically far more clear than we really even knew coming into this year. And that opportunity for us to really now rethink how having a healthy natural world directly affects our prosperity and well-being and protects us from future risks, pandemics, as well as natural disasters, allowing our economies to thrive, puts us into a very different place setting. And it allows us to think about what we have to do as a business leadership agenda to really make sure we're moving in that right direction with a clear and actionable path in a way that is very rooted in science, but also grounded in economics. So we want to be able to move to the types of leading target setting areas that set us up for future success, and the types of clear guidance and business pathways that allow us to do that together. We still have a big event building off of the huge Business for Nature event in June 15th as a virtual session for us, coming up now with the UN Biodiversity Summit, which has been announced for the 30th of September. That will be a big moment for us to ensure that leadership and business stays focused on what it is we can contribute as we head in then to what will be big events, either virtual or in person or some mix next year. We're going to see the IUCN World Conservation Congress in the early January. We have, of course, the World Economic Forum in Davos coming shortly after that. And then, of course, our big 2 UN events, UNCBD, which will now be in May in Kunming, leading into COP26, where nature and nature-based solutions will really have a center stage moment. Next slide, please. With that, I'm proud to turn it over to Peter White. He's going to take you through more of what the agenda is for the work to do ahead, led from WBCSD together with our important partners here. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Diane. Peter White here. At WBCSD, we've been working on nature ecosystems now for over 20 years. But where we are focused now is around the area of taking action on nature and trying to distill down what actually needs to be done at the present time. And that is boiled down, talking to members, into 3 big areas where we're active at the moment. The first is around trying to define what success looks like and providing measurements and targets for work on nature. And that's the whole work around creating science-based targets for nature in a similar way to in the past we've done science-based targets for climate. So that's the first of the work streams. Second of the work streams under the Nature Action Project is around nature-based solutions. You'll hear a lot about nature-based solutions today, about their importance and what they can deliver. But defining and providing guidance to companies on what nature-based solutions can do, how they could be measured, how they could be financed, how they could be taken forward is a key part of our work. And then taking those initiatives to the big meetings that are coming up, where policy is needed, where policy change is desired, and how we can communicate those key messages to the policymakers and opinion leaders in all the events that are coming up. So there are the 3 action streams within the Nature Action Project: science-based targets for nature, nature-based solutions, and the work on policy and leadership. Now, as I said, we've been working at WBCSD over 20 years on the whole nature agenda. What has been very clear over that time is a very distinct change in the way that it's thought of. And at the beginning, nature, in many ways, nature action was seen as almost CSR, as an issue that was managed on the side. What we see now is it's absolutely core for business, both in terms of risk, but also in terms of opportunity and solutions. And I think the other big change we've seen is that now nature is not considered as something separate. It is considered as linked to all the other big issues around climate, food, health, and particularly now post-COVID around prosperity and around employment. So take next slide, please. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Akanksha Khatri, who leads the Nature Action Agenda work at the World Economic Forum. And you will know that the World Economic Forum released the first report in the new Nature Economy series back in Davos in January, which was around the title Nature Risk Rising, to create awareness of the risk and also opportunity for business in nature. And they've now followed this up last week with the release of the second report, The Future of Nature and Business, and particular emphasis on prosperity and employment, and that link into the COVID agenda. So great pleasure to introduce Akanksha. Akanksha, please give us the highlights of the report that came out last week.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you everyone for having me. I understand the slide deck will also be shared with all the participants of this call, so I will try to be brief and not go into too much detail, something that we can do whenever moderates the panel, as well as any questions that you may have, please feel free to just type it in the chat box. Next slide. So I think Peter did mention this already in his introduction, but then just to put that out there is when the World Economic Forum started looking at the topic of nature, there was the question, how do we make the most useful and unique contribution to the space, which can only come from the forum given its multiple communities of CEOs and business partners, but also heads of state and governments. And to do that and making nature laws material to boardroom discussions and decision making with finance ministers, economy ministers, we took the approach of a new nature economy report series, which has been done with the framework of risks. That was the first report and came out in January. The second framework was on opportunities, which is the report that we released last week and will be discussing here today. And the third report on financing, which will come out sometime in fall, so at the virtual COP26 discussions, which will happen later in the year. Next slide, please. Another one. So this is really just setting context, which will of course not be new news to most of the people who have gathered here, given the commitment that each one of you have to this agenda. But just picking up on how things have really evolved so rapidly. Last year, we were talking about the IPBES headline, which was 1 million species at the risk of extinction due to human activity. Since then, we have realized that due to COVID, the zoonotic diseases and the rise of zoonotic diseases is not to do only with environmental factors, but also with how we as human beings are actually treating the environment. And therefore, it is very important that when countries and companies are thinking about the post-COVID recovery, that can only be done if we move away from business as usual and ensure that people and the planet are at the center of a recovery and a stimulus package. Next slide, please. This is a very quick view on how did we go about identifying why biodiversity and nature loss threats are actually material to business. And we did it in a way to look at the different threats through the lens of the impact that businesses have on biodiversity, the role that they have in driving them, and then the disruption that comes to businesses because of loss of nature. Next slide. And this, I would argue, is, of course, the most simplified slide of, or the simplified data of the report, but where the crux of the message is is more than approximately 80% of the nature loss can be attributed to these three socioeconomic systems, which are food, land, and ocean use, infrastructure and the built environment, and energy and extractives. It therefore gives me huge pleasure that the fellow panelists that I have today are the ones who are representing each of these sectors, because if we have to shift away from business as usual and address the topic of nature loss, we need transitions and systemic change in these three areas. Next slide, please. One more. So over the next few slides, I'd like to just talk about a few systemic transitions that the report talks about in each of those three socioeconomic systems. And while doing so, it is important that we are not asking for businesses to step up on leadership or policymakers to raise ambition because it's the morally right thing to do, but frankly, because it makes business sense. These transitions collectively are responsible for $10.1 trillion of business value and 395 million jobs by 2030. And they will be cut across in these three different systems. So if we move to the next slide, we see here what are the 6 systemic transitions that need to happen in food, land, and ocean use area, of which 5 are what we call core transitions, and the 6th is really more of an enabler transition. I understand it's a pretty expert and knowledgeable audience here, so I will not go into too much detail, but if I really had to call out 1 or 2 of them, which also connect very strongly with the work being done by both WBCSD, World Economic Forum on Business for Nature, that would be 1 is really looking at regenerative agriculture. I think there are multiple companies and coalitions such as the One Planet Business for Biodiversity, Fashion Pact, and others who are looking at adopting regenerative agriculture practices so as to have more of a nature positive operations in their supply chains. The second one is really looking at, say, sustainable supply chains. I think there's a huge amount of work being done on companies committing to deforestation-free supply chains. However, our research found out that of the Fortune 500 companies, less than 250 of them have actually committed to having a deforestation-free supply chain. So there's a huge amount of work that still needs to be done. Next slide, please. So I think we all end up talking a huge amount about food, land, and ocean use because that is where many of the consumer goods companies are anchored, and they are the ones who feel the first pinch when there is a change or a backlash from the consumer groups. However, there are also significant transitions which are needed in actually infrastructure in the built environment. By 2030, every week, there will be 1.5 million people who will be moving to the cities. So unless and until we take care of how do we create cities and how do we choose to live in our urban areas, we cannot meet nature positive goals by 2030. Next slide. So infrastructure in the built environment is actually one of the biggest drivers of global GDP of these 3 systems, as well as the one where much of the future growth will be created. Some have even argued that the post-COVID stimulus programs are going to be focused a lot, particularly in Africa and South and Southeast Asia, on creating new infrastructure. However, it's important that instead of really looking at sprawling with our urban areas and sprawling with our infrastructure development, can we look at more compact and dense environments? What that allows us to do is to really share and spare nature for other species and other ecosystem services instead of consuming that all for humanity, which frankly also depends on this delicate balance, which all of us know is biodiversity. Lastly, I think we often end up thinking of infrastructure as something that humans create and humans build, but we need to come to that point where we can think about green and green-gray infrastructure. So there is also massive amounts of infrastructure services provided by nature, such as disaster risk management, coastal, mangroves, and other areas. So those are pieces that the report goes much more deeply into. Also from a point of what are the savings as well as new value that is created. The next slide goes more into the third system that we are talking about, is on extractives and energy. And this is a very interesting one because when we artificially create these boundaries of climate and biodiversity, we think that just moving towards energy transition and moving towards renewables is actually going to solve our problem, which is not really the case. When we are looking at extractives and energy, we need to, one, look at energy transition in a way that is nature positive, so that just because we are solving for the climate crisis, we are not creating yet another new crisis by impacting biodiversity, animals, flora and fauna. So where we choose to create wind farms and solar farms, let's make sure that we are not clearing out forests for that purposes. The second one here is, if we go to the next slide, in addition, of course, to the jobs that it will create as well as the business opportunities, let's try to shift the way we look at our economic model from being just resource extractive to being resource compatible. And one way to do it is, of course, through circular economy. I think many of us would be familiar with the Das Gupta review on biodiversity, which was commissioned by the UK Treasury. And it often talks about human capital, financial capital, and natural capital. And if we see that over the past few years, while the capital which has been created by humanity in terms of physical or financial has been going up, but on the natural capital, we are performing really poorly. So let's start looking at externalities as well as resources in a more of a circular fashion rather than one where we just dig and move on. So that would be my three big systems and the messages over there. If we move to the next slide. How do we make it happen? And I think that's why all of us are gathered here. And between the World Economic Forum and WBCSD teams, the ambition that we come together when we are collaborating is, how do we make sure that we are transitioning towards the world that we want? And the only way we can do it is if we explore potential collaboration. And there is a very conscious decision that we have made to not go by industry silos alone, but really look at socioeconomic systems. Because when I am talking about food, land, and ocean use system, there is also the role that technology plays. There's also the role that farmers and businesses play. So it's not just about looking at one consumer good company, but really looking at a system. So we in the report encourage businesses to look at the transitions that are most relevant to them, and not just from a lens of what does it mean for their respective industry sector, but frankly, everywhere that their system actually connects and attaches with natural capital. And the other piece is on fourth industrial revolution technologies. I think all of us are so comfortable in terms of using Uber and Smoot and Food Eats and whatnot. But why is it that 4IR technologies haven't been able to disrupt in a positive way so that we can be living in more of a nature and planet compatible way? So there is a significant opportunity that exists, which is just waiting for businesses and frankly investors to be exploiting if we can scale it. Next slide. So this is really the big message that also was able to catch media attention last week, is who's going to pay for these transitions. It's all very well and good for the World Economic Forum to say that we need these transitions, but where is the money going to come from? Our research shows that to be able to realize the opportunity of $10 trillion, we need to invest $2.7 trillion. While that amount seems quite significant and huge, I think the COVID world has shown us that we are capable of drastic change and at a very short-term notice. So just in comparison, US alone in the month of March 2020 announced a stimulus of $2.2 trillion. So through our respective networks, how do we make sure that the money that is being put on the table for post-COVID recovery and stimulus packages is done in such a way that it isn't taking us back to the system which frankly created this problem, but is helping us shift towards more of a nature positive pathway. Next slide. So these are just top level messages, if I had to give a summary to everybody, is one, business as usual simply has no future. It's not viable, so let's not even waste time discussing what would that be. The second is we really need a transformation across all three socioeconomic systems, and some of them will build on top of each other. So for example, planet-compatible urban growth will ensure that we are looking at less pressure on land use, which will make sure that we are looking at more nature-compatible agriculture. The third is that there is a certain responsibility that businesses have, and now is the window of opportunity, because these three socioeconomic systems actually are responsible for 80% of the nature loss that we see. And then the businesses, I think Peter said it, like it's no longer a CSR, it's really at the core of how we survive for the next decade, and businesses survive themselves. And moving to these transitions, we can create $10 trillion of opportunities and 395 million jobs by 2030. The only way this will happen is we come together in a public-private setting and think about how do we push the right positive agenda. One of our constituents had said that we really need businesses to now start lobbying for nature. I think businesses have a fantastic capability in terms of pushing for change. How do we actually join initiatives like the Business for Nature call to action that Eva will speak about later to raise that ambition so that we give confidence to policymakers that this can be done. Next slide. So again, this is just like a capture of everything I have shared so far. So if you had to share one slide, this is the one I would love for you to be able to share and remember. But if we go to the next slide, that is looking at, in addition to the main report, if you go to the next slide, the forum also released a policy companion piece, which is now available on the website. And we literally pulled this together in the last month and a half to see how do we build on the policy piece which had come out in January by Business for Nature at Davos this year, but make it a little bit more contextual to the COVID recovery. So something that people can take and go to their respective ministers of finance, economy, or EU Commission to talk about why we need these building blocks for a resilient economic recovery. Because if we do not take care of the planet and nature, frankly, any recovery that we will look at will not be resilient and not be long-term sustained. So the way we can do it is if we protect and restore our natural capital assets. So a lot of you have been working on natural climate solutions as well, which talks about how do we protect and restore so that we are increasing resilience. The second is about enhancing resource productivity. So how do we look at more circular economic models as well as manufacture for long term rather than just manufacture for use and throw. And the last one is scaling regenerative value chains. So both in terms of regenerative fisheries, forestry, and agriculture, shift away from this dependency on agricultural inputs, but really allowing nature and the soil to heal on its own. So I think those are all the slides, hopefully, that I have covered. And then very happy to take any questions now or later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akanksha, and for covering so much in such a concise and clear way. So thank you for that great presentation. If you have any questions for Akanksha, there will be a chance in the panel coming up, but please put your questions in the chat. I've seen that there have been a couple of questions already coming up in the chat, so please keep them coming. Any questions about any of the presentations and anything that you would like our panel to address going forward. So I think, you summed it up beautifully there, Akanksha, but your comment, this just makes business sense. This is not CSR. Headlines, $10 trillion worth of opportunity, 395 million jobs by 2030. I mean, there are huge top line numbers. 3 systems and 15 key transitions to do that. And now what we'll do is we'll look at those, using the structure of those 3 systems that are in the report. We'll hear a little about what some of the leading companies are doing in this area going forward. So if we can move to the next slide, thank you. We will start with the infrastructure and built environment system, and delighted to have Ben Smith from Arup, where he's Director for Energy and Climate Change Consulting. So Ben, please tell us a little about how you're addressing the key transitions in your system.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me. If you haven't heard of Arup before, I suspect many of you have, but we're a large, at our core, we're an engineering consultancy, a global firm, but we also employ ecologists, landscape architects, designers, architects, to offer a sort of integrated built environment consultancy service, and hence fitting into this sector that Akanksha has set out in one of the 3 pillars in the WEF report. As Peter said, I'm a director in integrated cities team within Arup in London, but have a focus and a passion around nature-based solutions. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the work that we do in that space. And if you could just roll forward a few slides for me, that would be great. Perfect, thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to set out some of the sort of strategy work that Arup has been doing over the last couple of years. So we released our Global Sustainable Development Strategy in May of 2019. It was called A Better Way. And through that, we decided that we wanted to realign our firm over time to line up with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the 169 Sustainable Development Targets. And we went through quite an extensive exercise to think, well, what would that actually mean for a business like ours, given what we do? And thinking about which of the goals and targets are most material and would have the most impact, or which we need to kind of make the most changes around. And we decided we couldn't actually discount any of the targets because they all touched on something that we did in some way, but we wanted to try and give a bit more focus. So we chose these 6 blocks, which are shown in the pillar on the right hand side of the slide here, as our sort of main focus for at least the next couple of years. And actually, I should say, since this strategy was released, we've had a new group strategy, which is called which is the Arup Group Strategy, but the tagline for that is that sustainable development is everything. And if we just look down those pillars, those areas of focus are human health and well-being, zero carbon economy, circular economy principles, community resilience, social value, planetary boundaries. From my perspective, looking through the lens that I use, nature and biodiversity touches in every one of those areas. And I think that's come through quite clearly from Akanksha's presentation as well, and from the WEF report that was released last week. And you know, it doesn't take much to sort of imagine what those connections might be. I mean, we all know that if you get outside a bit more into some of the green spaces, it's good for physical and mental health. More than that, increasingly companies like ours are setting stringent targets around emissions reduction, and we know we can't do that within just the things that we have directly in our control through energy efficiency in our buildings and such like. So we're increasingly looking at biological sequestration techniques and tree planting, considering more than just carbon sequestration, but the impact that we have through those projects on nature and biodiversity as well. So if you roll forward a slide for me, please. Yeah, great. So I was just going to make the point, in sort of in terms of the built environment and cities in particular, we have a great focus on providing support to city governments around the world. We have a number of partnerships that we use to do that, one of which I lead, which is our C40 partnership, but we also have delivered 23 strategies under what was the 100 Resilient Cities programme, looking at urban resilience in these places. And 3 cities where I actually was personally involved in the strategy development were Rotterdam, Paris and Melbourne. And I would just say, I guess from the last sort of 5 or 6 years of experience, of whenever you're kind of producing a strategy for a city that might be focused on climate adaptation, urban resilience, nature-based solutions are always going to be coming through. And that doesn't matter if it's top-down driven or community, citizen level, bottom-up, that you always kind of arrive at a similar set of nature-based solutions because they deliver such a multitude of benefits. So in Rotterdam, there's a scheme for 10 kilometers squared of roof space, mainly in that case to attenuate rainwater, and it helped with ease flooding. In Melbourne, you have the urban forest plans. In Paris, you've got the Oasis schoolyards, which is responding to an issue around urban heat, but is seeing a number of schoolyards in Paris greened, and also providing space for community refuge and building community cohesion. More than that, in places like Tirana now, you're seeing the orbital forest coming forward. That's a project that Arup is working on as well. And I personally am, outside of work, actually a trustee of the National Park City Foundation. I've been campaigning on that for 5 or 6 years. Which is much more of a bottom-up initiative, but again, is something that Arup already also supports, and which WEF has helpfully profiled for us. And I think where the role of business is, I mean, cities can set out these kind of bold ambitions or these plans in their strategic planning framework, but it needs then either citizens, volunteers, or business, private sector, finance investors to come together to actually turn that vision into reality on the ground, whether that's converting meanwhile space, converting those roofs that I talked about in Rotterdam, or making some of the projects which build up to make the National Park City a reality actually happen on the ground. And I'm going to finish my presentation with the next slide, which is just one example of a project that's happening in London, which contributes to this bigger vision for nature in the city. It started as an ecology master plan for a client of ours called the Crown Estate, and they have lots of buildings all around the West End of London and the Theatre District. And they said, what might be some of the opportunities to integrate nature into this portfolio? So we set about making a bit of a plan for them. And over time, we've seen some of those spaces turn green. It's been quite exciting. And they got loads of positive feedback from people that were using their space, not just because of the biodiversity, but because they're nicer places to be, better retail experience, place to sit and relax, and congregate. And quite quickly, the other building portfolio owners around them sort of got wind of this and wanted to join a partnership, which we then coined as the Wild West End. And so other landowners, so Crown Estate have partnered with Grosvenor Estates, with Howard de Walden, with Shaftesbury, with Portman, which are all major kind of built asset owners in the West End of London to create this vision for the Wild West End. And Arup is the programme and technical manager for that project. It's getting quite a lot of attention, I think, in sort of international media, because you don't expect to go shopping or to go to the theatre in the West End of one of the biggest cities in the world and be met with honeybees and lavender and allotments on the rooftops. It's making a bit of an impact in our city here. So with that, I'll stop. I'm aware that I went slightly over time, so sorry, Peter, but I'll let others speak now.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I've had honey from the roof of Fortnum and Mason's in the centre of London. So if it's you to thank for that, thank you very much. Thanks for those great examples. We move on talking of honey and food. You'll have seen in Akanksha's summary that one of the system that has the big impact and the big opportunity is the food, land, and ocean use system. So addressing that, we're delighted to invite Andrea Alvarez. Andrea is the Chief Brand Innovation International and Sustainability Officer in Natura. And even with a title like that, we're grateful that you found the time to come and talk to us, Andrea. So please, what's happening in the food, land, and ocean use system at Natura?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, there's something wrong with the title. We need to fix it. No one should have a title that's that long. But it is a pleasure to be here today, honestly, and in this amazing panel to talk about something that is absolutely so critical for us. And I loved Akanksha's presentation where we talked about the absolute need for systemic change, because anything less than an approach that is systemic will not do the job, will not cut it. And so we need to find those transition plans where we move from the current way we do business and look at the world to the way that will actually regenerate the ecosystems in which we operate. So very good to be here today. Natura, for those of you who don't know, is part of the Natura & Co group. It's the founding company of the Natura & Co group, which is now the 4th largest pure beauty company in the world after the acquisition of The Body Shop and Avon and Aesop a couple of years ago. And the company has been, it was founded in 1959 with the intention at the time of doing business in a different way. And it's curious because The Body Shop also, through Anita Roddick, had this idea of building business as an unusual, business as unusual as an approach for business, where promoting social, environmental, cultural, and economic impact were part of the same scheme and the same ambition of success. So Natura has 3 founding beliefs: interdependence, diversity at the core, and the firm belief that if you will only be a resilient and a sustainable company over time if you actually have true value for the world in which we operate. And this has ended up in this business model that we see right here. We truly believe that the challenges, the social and environmental challenges that we face today are an inspiration for innovation and the creation of new business models. So Natura has this intention of promoting the well-being of the individual with oneself, with others, and with the whole. And we actually work against 3 core causes, which is to keep the forest standing, the idea that we should be producing more beauty and less waste, and the thought that at the core of this are people, so that every person matters, and that we should find business models that actually share value across the entire value chain. And then this is built into a whole way of how we operate through our management and organization practices, the brands and products we sell, and how we approach innovation, and our relationship network, because we chose to do relationship selling through over now 4 million different representatives across Latin America, and 6 million if we consider the entire world, as a way of distributing value. So all the way from the 5,000 families that are in the Amazon region that actually source products for us, all the way to the 4 million people at the other end of the spectrum who actually make their livelihood by selling Natura products or Natura & Co products. That value chain is designed to share and to transform. So next, please. We decided, next slide. I'm going to focus a little bit on the Amazon ecosystem, because this is an ecosystem that we've been involved in for over 20 years. And being in a region as nature abundant, one back please. Being in a region that as abundant as Brazil is, that has the largest tropical forest in the world still standing, where despite recent decisions otherwise and the facts that we've been facing, has actually managed to protect a significant portion of its natural capital. The game for us now is how do we conserve? Because we have seen through numerous reports and studies that it's actually so much more expensive for you to build back than to actually preserve what you have. So in that way, we have to find ways of interacting with the natural ecosystems in a way that we regenerate and keep the forest standing. And this is exactly what we've been doing for over 20 years. We've created a circular model in the Amazon region where we create alternative income for the populations that are there, creating with them the right social techniques for us to, social and agroforestry techniques that actually maintain the forest standing, and create shared value for everyone. This means that we currently interact with over 5.2 thousand families, which are 33 supplier communities, over 34 bioactive ingredients that we have in our supply chain. We've invested over 1.8 billion reais, which is, I would say, maybe $500 million roughly in the Amazon region. And we are going for 100% traceability of all of our supply chains. Actually, in the things that we source from the Amazon, they are already 100% traceable. And that's why we were honored with a Union for Ethical Biotrade certification. We were also awarded Champions of the Earth by the UN a couple of years ago. And all of this effort has managed to preserve 1.8 million hectares of conserved forest over the years that we've been operating there, which is half the size of Holland, which is huge, but minuscule if you consider the size of the Amazon, which actually shows the challenges that we have, which is, however good that is, it's insufficient to actually preserve the amount of land that we need to conserve in order not to reach a tipping point for the Amazon. Next, please. So we have established an ambition that we will go after innovation to help us produce positive social, economic, and environmental impact so that we can become not the best group of the world, but for the world. And we have recently, next please, and we have recently announced our 2030 vision, which we're calling our commitment to life, that is basically based on 3 pillars: address the climate crisis and protect the Amazon, defend human rights and be more humankind, and to embrace circularity and regeneration. And then we've got specific targets that we've laid out for all of the 4 companies. They have 0 to 2 year targets, 3 to 5, 5 to 10 year targets. And in the case of the Amazon, we will engage in joint efforts to basically produce 0 deforestation by 2025, which would be where the tipping point of that ecosystem would actually go into a situation and a dynamic that none of us want. So it is a pleasure to be here, and I hope to talk more in the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And just to repeat your last comment, if you have any questions for Andrea, please put them in the chat and we'll be able to explore them on the panel. Thanks for that great presentation. I love your saying there is no forest standing if we just stand still. That's a great call to action. And the fact that you're talking on your vision of the climate and protecting the Amazon and human rights and circularity and regeneration to show how all these things need to be connected. So thank you so much for that. We'll move on to the third of the systems now, and that's energy and extractives. And we would like to welcome Karen Wesley. Karen is the Vice President of Group Environment at Shell. Karen is kindly found the time to be with us today. It's the closed period for reporting at Shell. So unfortunately, Karen can't join the panel at the end. But if you have any questions for Karen, same as it with everybody else, please put them in the chat, and we will. Karen will endeavour to answer these after their closed reporting period is over. So, Karen, thank you for finding the time to be with us, and we look forward to hearing about the business leadership examples at Shell. Can you hear us, Karen?
Yes, can you hear me? All right.
We can hear you and we can see you perfectly. So the floor is yours, Karen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Shell's work with nature-based solutions. I'll talk about three things. First is the business case for why we're looking into that. The second one is the three pillars of our strategy. And the third one is barriers to the way forward and growth and some of the opportunities for partnership there. In terms of the business case, essentially, this slide is a summary of our current net zero emissions energy aspiration to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. And the role of nature-based solutions really takes three key areas of this ambition. The first one is that nature-based solutions will contribute to our climate ambition. The second one is that nature-based solutions will help us help our customers have lower emissions from products that they buy from Shell. And the third one is that they're a competitive investment in carbon sequestration at a time when the world is carbon constrained. So those are the three reasons why Shell is exploring nature-based solutions. Before I talk more about our strategy around this, I wanted to start with one very significant and important caveat, which is partly summarized in my next slide, which is that nature-based solutions can only be one of many efforts to lower the carbon impact of the energy system. So they have to really fit in with avoid, reduce, and offset mindset. And this slide just summarizes all the different things that are going on across Shell to support that decarbonization mission. And whereas tactics and solutions do differ across companies, I think the common theme is that no company can afford just to do one of these things. So essentially, when it comes to urgent action on climate change, we have to try everything because really we need to guarantee winners, and you have to back all the horses to get there. And nature-based solutions is therefore one of the range of options that we're looking for in the avoid, reduce, offset scheme. That's very important for the legitimacy of the work we're doing, and we understand that and accept that. Moving on to then what we actually do, we're essentially looking at three pillars, and the next slide just summarizes, and I'll start from the customer perspective through to the supply side. From a customer perspective, what we're looking for is offering carbon neutral driving solutions to motorists. We've started in the Netherlands and the UK. And we essentially started that work by speaking with more than 4,000 customers to try and shape the CVPs, understand what's on their mind and how we can help them tackle their carbon footprint. And carbon neutral driving is one of those offers. Shell has been for many years well positioned in the marketing and trading area. So we're one of the most established investors of carbon credits in the world, therefore quite experienced in the different schemes, regimes, and what's needed to make them successful and legitimate. And then the other area is on the supply side, investing in natural ecosystems to reduce emissions and capture more CO2, whilst, as was explored in the previous presentations, looking to benefit in terms of both communities and biodiversity. So that means in the Netherlands, we're planting more than 5 million trees in partnership with the Dutch State Forestry Service. In Spain, we're doing a pilot project of about 300 hectares with the Land Life company. This is degraded land. And in the UK, we're working in partnership to generate carbon credits by helping to plant around 1 million trees over the next 5 years. In Australia, we are restoring 1,000 hectares of endangered wooded grassland. So these are all efforts that don't currently produce credits, but in the longer term, we expect within 5 years for them to do so. So all of those things really come together around the concept of partnership and all the collaboration that's been discussed by the other participants and presenters. And the reason why collaboration and partnership is so important is that this market is new, still has a ways to go before it can grow and be as material as it can be with respect to supporting the climate change agenda. We've talked about the amount of forest that you would actually need to act as a buffer in climate change, and that's probably the size of the Amazon. And essentially what that means is there are 3 areas where partnership's important. One of them is working with governments to resolve the issues around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. The second one is around the legitimacy question, as I've mentioned before. How do we make sure that this is a mechanism that's used in the correct way and for the right outcomes, which are broader than just the carbon credits that's been mentioned as well. And then finally, in terms of making sure that the standards and the credits themselves meet the best protocols and are themselves generating the benefits that are expected. So with those areas, Shell's very active in partnerships, including with the World Economic Forum and with many others. We work to ensure that all our projects maintain the appropriate health and safety and security and social governance standards. And also we assess our projects against the requirements of climate, community and biodiversity standards. So I don't want to give the impression that any of these challenges are too difficult to tackle, because we do believe that there's a growing sense of excitement here. The stage is set for nature-based solutions, as Diane showed in the external work to come, and we also want to be a part of that, and we hope that you will be too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And you stress the importance of partnerships. I mean, the nature-based solutions are important as part of the solution, but only part of the solution, as part of a more integrated strategy. I think all very good key points there. We'd like to move on now to our last short presentation before the panel discussion. And we have Paul Jeffries from BP, where he's head of policy. And so we get another view on the energy and extractives piece. So over to you, Paul. Last comments before we open the panel. Can you hear us, Paul? We can see your slides. Can you, Paul?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
We can hear you perfectly now. Thank you.
Somebody had muted me. Yeah, today I'm going to talk about three things. BP's new purpose and ambition, specifically our position on biodiversity, and the role of natural climate solutions. So next slide. Next slide. You may not have noticed, but back in February, the previous slide, back in February, we made some quite significant announcements as a company, both about a new purpose and ambition for the company, and about some quite dramatic reorganization to deliver the purpose and ambition. In terms of the purpose, it was explicitly, as it says on the slide, to reimagine energy for people and the planet. And those elements are significant: energy, people, and the planet. with a specific ambition to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world get to net zero as well. So all of those three elements, energy, climate, people, and planet, are linked very explicitly and increasingly proactively under the label and banner of sustainability in the company. And as sort of evidence of our sincerity around that, in terms of the radical reorganization of the company, a new role was introduced as Executive Vice President, reporting to the Chief Executive, responsible for strategy and sustainability as a single unit. So sustainability, to the point that has been made a number of times, is no longer a CSR element tacked on as an afterthought. It is very much integral to and part of our strategy. We're going to be speaking in a little bit more detail about what that looks like for BP in September. But in the meantime, in the months since February, we have introduced both a significantly strengthened human rights policy to support the people component, but also a new biodiversity position, which I will come on to talk to in a second. One last point on this. The reason COVID is referenced here is that when we made our announcement, COVID wasn't really an issue, but very quickly became one. And we were immediately asked whether our purpose and ambition would be affected or delayed by COVID. And our response was precisely the opposite. If anything, it has sort of strengthened our determination to meet our purpose and deliver our ambition. And that is because COVID, I think, has demonstrated to everyone the interconnectedness of various systems, planetary systems, human systems, climate systems, and illustrated, as well as their connectedness, their vulnerability, and therefore the requirement almost to create resilience across multiple systems. So that's the reference to COVID here. And I think Building Back Better is a real opportunity for bringing finance into nature. Next slide. No, the next one. So with respect to the biodiversity position that we introduced in February specifically, there are four elements. The first is quite a specific and bounded one in the sense that it is about boundaries and protected areas. And we have made a commitment not to operate any new oil and gas exploration or production activities within World Heritage, cultural and natural sites. So a very specific commitment. This isn't an ambition, it's a commitment. And the same within IUCN Category 1A, which is strict nature reserves, and also in wilderness areas, which are IUCN categories 1B. So that's a very specific commitment, effective as of January the 1st this year. Our second component of our position is an aim, this time to achieve a net positive impact on biodiversity in our new projects. And to a point that I think it was a who made it, this isn't limited only to our oil and gas operations. It's net positive impact for all our new projects, all our projects in renewable energy, for example. So it's quite wide ranging. We will also aim to enhance biodiversity around our existing operations. The phraseology is slightly different because our approach will have to be different in respect of existing operations relative to new projects, because existing operations are already there, and we will have to modify them, obviously. And finally, in countries where we have significant investments and activities, we will support biodiversity restoration, including the sustainable use of natural resources. So hopefully you'll see that there are some quite specific, quite wide-ranging and quite positive and ambitious aims and commitments in our new biodiversity position. So that's very much focused on sort of wild nature itself. And then if we move to the last slide, just to pick up some of the points that Karen was making, the area where we think, if you like, energy, climate, people, and the planet can come together most powerfully is around natural climate solutions, because our view is that they are necessary to deliver the Paris goals, but they also carry co-benefits for nature, particularly biodiversity, but also for the communities that live and work in some of the most influential land use sectors, and particularly forestry. But in order for those natural climate solutions to deliver in those 3 dimensions, they really do have to be done well. And what I mean by that is that the quality of supply in respect of environmental and social safeguards, as well as the carbon benefit, have to be properly developed and monitored and verified, and that the way in which NCS are used as offsets has to be appropriate and agreed. And for us, this is one of the ways of bringing finance at large scale into a sector, the land sector, that has traditionally suffered from, if you like, a lack of value attached to it. And this is one major way of doing it. So, and in order to do that, partnerships are critical, and they need to be partnerships between governments and the private sector, civil society and the private sector, academia, between markets supplying NCS and using NCS. So partnerships to the successful delivery of NCS, I think, are absolutely mission critical, but they are developing, and the WEF NCS Alliance is one of the most, I think, impressive and optimistic. So I think that'll do, Peter. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That'll do very nicely. So thank you very much, Paul. And let's move on again. If you have any specific questions for Paul, Paul is also in the reporting period, and he said he's happy to answer questions, but not obviously ones that are of any financial significance. So bear that in mind when you ask him questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. But for the panel itself, if we go to the next slide, please, I'd like to hand over to Eva Zabi, who many of you will know, who leads Business for Nature, the Executive Director for Business for Nature. And Eva will, I would say grill, but she will moderate the questions to our panel. Andrea, Ben and Paul, and Akanksha sent her apologies, but she had another pressing engagement she had to drop off. So we have Andrea and Ben and Paul, and the floor is yours, Eva.
Thanks so much, Peter. Clearly you've sometimes been on a panel when I've been moderating, and you know,
I have the scars to prove it.
You've got the are you going to be grilled? But anyway, listen, thanks so much. It's really such a pleasure to be here and to see so many of you on the line, familiar names. I've worked with many of you closely when I was at WBCSD for about 15 years before moving on to lead Business for Nature. So it's really a pleasure. And just, you know, to get our minds into this, I was thinking earlier, you know, I want you to wonder, I want you to think of in what year did WBCSD and IUCN publish the report that was called Business and Biodiversity, a Guide for the Private Sector. We're not doing a poll, but just think of a year in your head. And the actual answer for that is 1997. So when Peter was saying earlier, we've been working on this stuff for more than 20 years, it's true, we've got the proof. And so, you know, we were leading the work on how do you incorporate, you know, first of all, what is biodiversity ecosystems? How do you incorporate that? And then how do you value through, for example, natural capital assessments, including in risk management, mainstream, you know, performance metrics, etc. And so, but we all know that timing is everything, right? And so that's why here today, hearing from Akanksha on the new WEF second report, the content that was presented is excellent, it's compelling, But there's a timing point here, is that it's actually really symbolic and significant that it is the World Economic Forum that has come out with this. And we should really acknowledge that, I think, as a step change in how mainstream sometimes, well, I think some of these discussions are becoming, whereas before it was only a handful of companies that were engaged with us. Now we've got hundreds, which is really brilliant. But anyway, my role is not to babble on for hours. It's to ask interesting questions. And we actually got a couple from the chat. But I'm going to start off by asking Ben, in fact, a question and picking up on one of these questions from the audience, from Bim. So thank you very much. You know, I have a feeling a little bit about, you know, on the one side, it's great that we have a lot of these compelling, you know, packaging of the $10 trillion of economic value and the nearly 400 million jobs that could be created. When we get down to it, the solutions that we're talking about have been known for a while. We've been talking about energy efficiency in buildings, circular economy in textiles, regenerative agriculture, natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions, even though they might not have been called that at the time. So are we just repackaging something? And if that's the case, great. Language actually has a really important role to play here to make things compelling. Or you know, are we confusing people? So Ben, over to you. Any reactions on those points, please?
Yeah, thanks, Eva. I think you're right. We have been talking broadly about these things for certainly my whole career. I think when I first started, climate adaptation wasn't really a thing, but we were talking about flood risk and flood risk mitigation. So I do agree with that. I think there's two things that have really changed in the last few years, and which really have the potential to really drive investment into these areas from a business perspective. I think one is the boundary of emissions that we're now considering in most businesses. So I think it's only really been in the last few years that business are seriously thinking of their supply chain emissions and their scope 3 emissions, as opposed to just the emissions that they directly emit. And also, I think the targets are changing. So, you know, we haven't previously been setting zero carbon targets for ourselves. We haven't been setting targets beyond what it's possible to achieve by taking measures within our own operational footprint. So we're now considering a broader boundary of emissions and setting more stringent targets. And that's forcing us to think about more creative solutions. It's going to drive partnerships, because if you're in the case like Arup, most of our emissions, our direct emissions are in cities, in the buildings that we own, and some of which we rent, but where we have our offices. We know that we can get so far in reducing those emissions through the sorts of measures that we can take in our buildings by reducing business travel and so on, but there will still be these residual emissions. So how do we deal with that? And I think that's forcing us to think about, as Paul was talking about, the sort of nature-based kind of sequestration opportunities. And when we do that, we think about which clients can we partner with, which of our clients have lots of land. And ultimately, because we're a consultancy, we then think about, well, if we're going to do this, how can we make it a service that we can sell to others? And how do we learn and then become, you know, an advisor of choice for others who are in a similar situation? So yeah, I'll stop talking, but I think those two things are the things which have changed for me in the last 2 years, and which are driving a lot more energy into this space.
Would you say, just following up on your last point on the, you know, being able to use some of this intel and expertise as, you know, services for clients, which makes a lot of sense. Do you feel that that's something that's just going to grow exponentially?
I do, and we are sort of winning support internally. We want to do some test sequestration projects, basically, which are Arup funded for ourselves. But then because all of our clients in the built environment will need to basically be able to buy credible offsets, and we want to be able to advise on the challenges that we've had in bringing those projects to life. You know, it's not just about how quickly you can sequester emissions, it's all the other things you have to consider. It's the fact that you might lose some trees along the way. There's different cost models. There's going to be different models depending on where you do it, based on soil or geology or so. So we want to kind of learn that, if we can, for ourselves, such that we get, you know, we have a really good solution that we can take to others. So, but yeah, we're not unique in that. In doing that work, we're talking to other companies who are doing exactly the same thing.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think it's a very justifiable need to then help navigate through this complexity, because as we go into these interconnected systems, it's really hard and it's pretty painful. And I wanted to turn to Paul now again, in terms of, you know, first of all, I would just reflect on hearing from, you know, yourself and you know, and Shell and BP sharing today how you're reimagining, reinventing. This is not necessarily a very comfortable business model. This is, you know, it demonstrates leadership and some, you know, sticking your neck out in a way to develop these new business models and opportunities and to mitigate the risks. So how we mitigate and tackle the climate emergency, nature loss and inequality together means, as we've been talking about, that we need these interconnected systems. And I was just curious to know, you know, how within BP, as you've come up with some of these, you have your biodiversity position, there are all these other ambitions around climate, etc. How internally are you managing to understand those synergies or potential trade-offs?
Well, I think the motivation has come, you know, partly from a chief executive who is, you know, very committed to social and environmental issues. I think it's a recognition that there is very significant opportunity in doing the right thing, whether it's in respect of the environment or social issues and human rights, and whether it's in respect of biodiversity and human rights. And I don't mean simply reputational opportunities in being seen to do the right thing. You know, I think it's our firm belief that it is good business to do the right thing. You know, both in the shorter term, then there can be immediate paybacks. But in the longer term, I think it's going to become increasingly the expectation from society, from investors, that companies who on the one hand have the potential to impact the environment or society in a negative way, also have the potential to impact the environment and society in a positive way. And that's why I think you're seeing us move from a position of, you know, trying to sort of do no net harm, if you like, not just provide environmental and social safeguards, but shifting to a position in the case of biodiversity of seeking to create net positive impact, and likewise in the area of climate change, not just to reduce our emissions, if you like, but to reduce our emissions to net zero within the next 3 decades or sooner.
And do you think you're going to, sorry, just to jump in, but do you think you're going to use this WEF report and the one from January around, you know, nature risk rising that we've also referenced? Are you using these also as a way internally to get even more functions on board with this agenda? Or well, people basically bought in because it comes from the CEO?
No, well, I mean, to answer your first question, absolutely, we have used both the previous report and the recent report to inform our positioning. But people in the company absolutely have bought into this agenda, and not because I think it's come from the CEO, although obviously it's very important and helpful that the CEO has led from the top. But I think because culturally in the company, there has always been, you know, since the days at least of John Brown, if not before that, a sort of a cultural predisposition to work for an oil and gas company that does care about the environment and society. And I know there have been some sort of tragic occurrences along the way. But I don't think, you know, those certainly are not a reflection of, if you like, the culture or beliefs of the company or the people who work for it. So I think it's a combination of things. And to your point about timing, you know, I think the time is right. It has been increasingly clear that the time is right. And if you needed any sort of further evidence of that, I think COVID has given it. It has demonstrated unequivocally, not just that the time is right, but these are the right things to do. And not just the right things to do morally, but the things we have to do practically.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. for sure the urgency element moving to Brazil with Andrea, I think is hugely clear. And Andrea, I'll come to you now. I was that school kid with my Greenpeace mug and my Body Shop backpack, and you know, I actually have a whole load of questions I could ask you, Andrea, around your environmental profit and loss and how you managed to deal with all these interrelated challenges around livelihoods and and biodiversity, etc. But I think the trickier question, maybe in terms of really understanding how we can scale some of these solutions, has to come down to regulation and the government that you operate in. And so it was really amazing on the 15th of June at our big event when Roberto Marques, who's the CEO of Natura & Co., said, we will not rest until there's zero deforestation in the Amazon. And we saw a few weeks ago international investors writing to the government to say they're threatening to pull out of the region if the Amazon isn't managed properly, and that's because of risk management. It's very simple risk management. So I'd be really keen to hear how you navigate through that, and any recommendations for others on the line that can help with that. Obviously, a lot of what Business for Nature as a global coalition representing a unified business voice is trying to do is to give that international perspective. And we do engage in specific areas like Brazil. But anyway, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect on that and share how all of us on the line can help and how we can learn from that in other areas to scale up.
Fantastic. I mean, some of the studies that are being conducted on the Amazon region point the challenge of the Amazon as probably one of the most complex issues globally ever. So to find a solution for the Amazon forest where you can reconcile economic development with forest conservation, with science, with engaging with the indigenous and with the people that operate there, in a country where inequality is still very high, in a country that was colonized and which many of its riches were considered as things for expropriation, many times to a Eurocentric vision of the world and how it operated. All of that has resulted into a scenario that is a challenge. It is a challenge. Now, I guess the sad thing is, if you look at the natural capital that is still standing in the Latin American region, it is immense. Over 82% of the forest has been conserved. And it's important for us to remember that, because when we see those fires, we really freak out and we say, oh my God, what is happening? And they must be stopped. They must be stopped. And there will need to be some kind of a coalition where, public policy, the government, private sector and civil society, as well as consumers and the population at large, realize that the conservation of that ecosystem is critical, not only for our existence, but even if you want to be shorter term, for the economic development of the country. I mean, Brazil has everything to be a carbon powerhouse, given the immense natural capital that is still standing. So to look at it with that view is, I think, where we are going. And I think society has woken up, and I think people have raised their voices. And I do think that this is a combination of the digital capabilities and the technology that's out there now. I think the youth movement has played an immense role in creating awareness towards, just public awareness towards the whole climate discussion and the agenda. And we do have the technology and the capability to find solutions. Now, they are very complex and they have to take human beings into consideration. I mean, if we don't consider the inequality issue, if we don't consider that crime is really many times what is driving a lot of the deforestation that's happening there, be it in whatever production system we talk about, this is a very multifaceted challenge that needs to be addressed as a whole. So we obviously invite all of the, solutions and thinking that have been possibly proven elsewhere, they will have to be adapted to that ecosystem and to those livelihoods. So making sure that we engage with the people that are on ground is, to me, what has to happen first and foremost, so that we don't apply typical way of solving things that we know don't necessarily create the best results to a very complex ecosystem. But we're part of this agenda, and yes, we've made it a big and bold statement of our commitment to work towards that zero deforestation by 2025. And we are working as a collective with many stakeholders in Brazil and outside of Brazil to make sure that, these plans and these solutions, and they will be multiple solutions, that they are in place soon enough, because yes, it is urgent.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Andrea. I'm going to ask you all, we're getting to the end, but all of your leaders get it. That's why you're so here, speaking so eloquently. You've obviously been thinking about this a lot. And there might be people on the line who don't necessarily, who aren't as blessed, I suppose, to have that buy-in from the top. So I want you to imagine that you don't have that buy-in, and that you have 1 minute pitch on how material is nature and biodiversity loss for your company, how do you think it will evolve in 10 years, and why? So what is it that you would say, actually you need to know that biodiversity and nature loss is material to our company because ... So who's going to go first? I'm going to go to Andrea, back to you, because you're ready with it.
Okay. So yes, nature and biodiversity loss. Nature is an extremely important element for our company, not only because we use ingredients from Brazilian biodiversity in our portfolio, and it is part of our strategic agenda, but also because that we think that when we implement, we have evidence that of the value that nature loss creates or does not create when the wrong things are done. So I would say that in a nutshell is where we're going.
Great, thanks so much. It's hard. Well, Peter kind of set the bar saying I was going to grill you, so it's a nice one to end with. Go on, Paul. What would you say in a minute?
How is biodiversity material now? Well, I mean, hopefully in my presentation, by describing the position specifically on biodiversity, and then sort of indicating that, natural climate solutions for us are both a big part of the solution to global biodiversity loss and climate change, as well as being a business opportunity. I think in terms of evolution, I would like to see us, along with others, sort of co-develop proper metrics for biodiversity loss that are applied and demonstrate generally, but certainly in the case of our company, that we have met our ambition, that we have made a net positive impact. And why? I think particularly in the case of the avoidance of large-scale forest loss, but also other forms of land use, that without success in those areas, we really cannot deliver the Paris goals, as well as undermining all sorts of other forms of resilience, including health resilience. So, to me, it's a sine qua non. It's an existential requirement to make success of preserving wild nature.
Thanks, and that's interesting connection then with the climate argument. And Ben?
It's a great question. I think it's important to make sure that people stop talking in these silos and realise that the climate and the ecological emergency are so connected. I think no matter what organisation you work in, there will be colleagues of yours who will be very keen to support this if you want to stand up and try and make some change. It's not always been the case that every leader in every organisation supports this. Sometimes we have to put some evidence together and take a paper and be prepared to be pushed away and then go back again. There's enough information out there for people whichever company they're working in, to make a case which is specifically relevant to the organisation they're in, based on the context of what that company does, what their supply chain looks like, where they get their business from, who their clients and partners are, and so on. So I would say if you're on the call and you think your company is not doing enough, there's definitely something you can do to raise it up the agenda. And if I may, if you'll just humour me for one moment, like, you know, 6 years ago, a very good friend of mine said, you know, why is it that we only recognise and celebrate nature in rural places, that we never take any notice of nature in our cities? Why don't we use the inspiration of the rural national parks and do something in a city that can build a movement of people around it, that can inspire people to get involved and help celebrate this nature in a city? We've gone to every single ward in London, 670 of them, and got their support. We've gone to the mayor, we've gone to the London Assembly, we got the mayoral support, we had a big party at City Hall, and London's now the world's first national park city. It's a 6-year campaign. It's now inspiring businesses to try and connect to that agenda. You know, it's been a bit of fun, actually. It's been outside of work, but I think the point here is, and not to labour on that particular example, but leadership can come from anywhere. So tap into the energy where it exists and try and make more of it.
Excellent, thanks, Ben. And so we can flip on, thank you so much to all three of you. We can flip on to the next slide, because what we need now is the leadership, but also the momentum. We need the breadth of support by as many companies as possible as part of all of the actors in society to reverse nature loss in this decade. And that's why Business for Nature has a call to action, which is very simple. It's only 3 sentences. They're on your screen here, that says nature is everyone's business. That middle one is what we need right now. The governments must adopt policies now to reverse nature loss in this decade. That will give confidence and courage to policymakers to actually agree these negotiations and international agreements like the Paris Agreement, but for nature, which is everything that's being discussed. Lots of companies have already signed up. Please join them before the 1st of September. And listen, thank you so much. With that, I'll hand back over to Peter.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you to all the panel for those enlightened comments. Just remains for me to sort of sum up and close. I mean, essentially, we've heard today, you've heard the summary of the WEF report. I mean, Akanksha summed it up very, very succinctly. It's good for business, and we've just heard that, you know, one of the understanding the relevance. Andrea said there's evidence of value in nature. Paul said we're not going to deliver Paris without it. And Ben said, you know, we need the partnerships and to break down the silos and make sure that we link that the nature with the climate going forward. Akanksha said, you know, there are 3 things going forward. First is understanding the relevance. I think we've done that. The second is to explore the collaborations. We've talked about a lot of partnerships today. The third was around the enablers of what we need to do to help make this actually happen. Some of the work that WBCSD is doing that we talked about earlier, hopefully will help some of that act as enablers. The fact we need to find ways to measure progress and identify where we're going. So science-based targets are essential, and work is going ahead on that side. The second is, we've heard a lot today about nature-based solutions. WBCSD is engaged in preparing guidance for members, for companies, as to what nature-based solutions are, how they can help, how you could measure them, how they can be implemented, and how they can be financed. And then we need to take all this, as Eva said, we need to take this as a collective business voice to the key global events. So watch out for that work coming out shortly. We'll be sharing the work in those 3 areas as we go forward. Just remains to me to take the next slide. Just in closing, just to remind you, you can get obviously the WEF report, you can download from the World Economic Forum's website. We provided a business summary to all those of you who've registered, but expect to see that appearing on our website also soon. And as Eva said, don't forget the call to action, the Business for Nature call to action. So please get your companies to sign up to that as soon as possible, so that we get that aligned business voice. We talked a lot about COVID. If you want to know what is happening regarding work of business activity addressing COVID, look on the WBCSD website. There's a whole range of different initiatives and actions that you can see there. So I'd just like to finish by thanking you for participating. If you have sent questions in, for those who couldn't answer, we will make sure that we get you answers to that. Just to thank everybody, Akanksha for the summary of the report, Andrea, Ben, and Karen and Paul for their presentations and for the panel, and thank you, Eva, for moderating so wonderfully. So thank you all, enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you on another WBCSD session in the future. Thank you all, bye for now.